The day Britain disappeared beneath the sea, the lost world of Doggerland. For thousands of years, people have believed that Britain has always been an island, surrounded by the cold waters of the North Sea. Separated from mainland Europe by the English Channel, it feels as though Britain has stood alone since the beginning of time. But that picture is completely wrong. Not thousands, but tens of thousands of years ago, you could have stood on what is now the coast of eastern England and walked all the way to modern-day Denmark or the Netherlands without ever getting your feet wet. There were no ferries, no cliffs overlooking the sea, and certainly no channel dividing Britain from Europe. Instead, there stretched before you one of the richest landscapes in prehistoric Europe, a vast wilderness of forests, rivers, marshes, lakes, and open grasslands where humans had lived for generations. Today, that entire world lies hidden beneath the waters of the North Sea. It has no surviving towns, no standing monuments, and almost no visible trace that it ever existed. Yet beneath those waves rests an entire lost country, larger than many modern nations, where families hunted together, children grew up beside winding rivers, and countless generations built lives that would eventually vanish beneath the sea. The story of Doggerland is not simply the story of a drowned landscape. It is the story of how Britain became an island, how climate transformed human history, and how an entire homeland disappeared so completely that the world forgot it had ever existed. What makes this even more extraordinary is that no one intentionally discovered Doggerland. Unlike Pompeii or Tutankhamun's tomb, there was no dramatic archaeological expedition or famous explorer uncovering its secrets. Instead, its story emerged slowly through chance discoveries made by ordinary fishermen working in the North Sea. For generations, their nets occasionally brought up strange objects that seemed impossible. Instead of fish, they recovered enormous bones from creatures that no longer walked the earth: woolly mammoths, giant deer with antlers stretching wider than a small car, prehistoric bison, woolly rhinoceroses, and even the bones of ancient lions emerged from the seabed. Mixed among them were carefully shaped flint tools that could only have been made by human hands. These discoveries puzzled scientists for decades. How could the remains of land animals be resting on the floor of the sea? The simplest explanation was also the most astonishing. Those animals had not died in the sea. They had died on dry land, because the seabed itself had once been part of a living landscape. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten chapters of human history, consider subscribing to Unknown Discoveries. Every documentary on this channel explores real archaeological discoveries, ancient mysteries, and scientific evidence that challenge the stories many of us thought we already knew. There are still countless secrets hidden beneath our feet and sometimes beneath the sea. To understand Doggerland, we have to travel back more than 20,000 years to the height of the last ice age. Much of northern Europe was buried beneath colossal sheets of ice that reached hundreds of meters thick. These glaciers locked away such enormous amounts of water that global sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are today. The North Sea did not exist in the form we know it. Instead, what is now open water was an immense plain stretching across the horizon. Rivers that now empty into the sea merged into giant waterways flowing across this landscape before eventually reaching the distant Atlantic. The Thames, the Rhine, the Meuse, and other great rivers were connected in ways that seem almost unimaginable today. Britain was not isolated. It formed the northwestern edge of continental Europe. Far from being a frozen wasteland, Doggerland was one of the most productive environments of its age. As the climate gradually warmed after the Ice Age, dense forests spread across the land. Oak, pine, birch, hazel, and willow covered large areas, while marshes and wetlands attracted countless species of birds and fish. Herds of red deer moved through the woodlands, Wild horses grazed across open grasslands. Massive aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, roamed the plains, standing taller than most humans and weighing nearly a ton. Beavers engineered waterways while wolves, lynx, and brown bears hunted in the forests. For hunter-gatherer communities, it was an environment of extraordinary abundance. Unlike later farming societies, these early people did not build permanent cities or cultivate crops. Their survival depended on understanding the rhythms of nature with astonishing precision. They knew where fish gathered during seasonal migrations. They recognized the paths used by deer long before written maps existed. They understood which plants could heal illness, which berries were safe to eat, and how weather patterns changed throughout the year. Every decision mattered because a mistake could mean starvation. Their knowledge of the landscape was not simply impressive, it was essential. Archaeological evidence recovered from the North Sea suggests these communities were highly adaptable and remarkably skilled. Flint blades found beneath the seabed demonstrate advanced stoneworking techniques, capable of producing tools sharp enough to butcher large animals or shape wood into spears and shelters. Animal bones bearing cut marks reveal organized hunting and food preparation, while preserved fragments of ancient peat indicate that forests once covered vast areas now submerged beneath the waves. Scientists have even recovered fossilized pollen grains from the seabed, allowing researchers to reconstruct the ancient vegetation with surprising accuracy. Layer by layer, these tiny traces reveal a landscape far richer than anyone had imagined only a century ago. Life in Doggerland was shaped by movement. Families followed the seasons, traveling between rivers, forests, lakes, and coastal wetlands to take advantage of changing food supplies. During warmer months, they gathered berries, nuts, edible plants, shellfish, and freshwater fish. In colder seasons, they focused on hunting larger mammals whose meat, hides, and bones were essential for survival. Children would have learned these skills from an early age, watching parents and grandparents read tracks in the mud or recognize subtle signs that an animal had recently passed through the forest. Around evening fires, stories were shared not only for entertainment but as practical lessons, passing on knowledge that had kept families alive for countless generations. To modernize, this way of life may appear simple. Yet surviving in prehistoric Europe demanded extraordinary intelligence. Without maps, compasses, metal tools, written language, or modern medicine, these communities thrived in an environment that changed continuously. They adapted to shifting seasons, unpredictable weather, dangerous predators, and the constant challenge of finding enough food. In many ways, their understanding of the natural world exceeded our own. They knew every river crossing, every migration route, every edible plant, and every safe place to shelter long before those landscapes disappeared forever. For thousands of years, Doggerland flourished. Generations were born, raised families, and were buried there. Children grew into grandparents without ever imagining that the land beneath their feet would one day vanish. To them, these forests and rivers seemed as permanent as Britain itself feels to us today. Yet beneath this peaceful world, forces were already in motion that would transform not only their lives, but the very geography of Europe. At first, the changes were almost impossible to notice. A familiar shoreline crept a little farther inland. A marsh expanded where dry ground had once existed. A favorite hunting trail became flooded during unusually high tides. These small changes seemed insignificant, spread across decades and generations. But together, they marked the beginning of one of the greatest environmental transformations humanity has ever witnessed. The sea was returning, and with every passing century, it came a little closer. For centuries, the disappearance of Doggerland remained completely unknown because no one imagined that the seabed itself might preserve the outline of an ancient country. That changed only in the 20th century, and ironically, the discovery had nothing to do with archaeology. It began with the search for oil and natural gas. Energy companies exploring beneath the North Sea used seismic technology to peer through layers of rock hidden beneath the seabed. By sending sound waves deep underground and measuring how they bounced back, they created incredibly detailed maps of what lay below. Their goal was to locate oil reservoirs, but what appeared on their screens surprised everyone. Beneath the sand were winding river valleys, ancient lake beds, rolling hills, and coastlines carved by flowing water. These were not random geological features. They were the unmistakable fingerprints of a landscape that had once been exposed to the open sky. Archaeologists quickly realized that these industrial surveys represented one of the greatest accidental discoveries in the history of prehistoric Europe. When combined with the mammoth bones, stone tools, fossilized pollen tree stumps, and animal remains already being recovered from fishing nets and dredging operations, an extraordinary picture began to emerge. Scientists were no longer imagining Doggerland. They were beginning to map it with remarkable precision. The rivers that had once carried fresh water could be traced for hundreds of kilometers beneath the sea. Ancient forests could be identified through preserved layers of peat. Even former lakes and marshes could be reconstructed using microscopic evidence preserved within the sediments. Piece by piece, an entire lost world was being brought back into view. One of the most fascinating aspects of Doggerland is that it challenges how we think about prehistoric people. For many years, hunter-gatherers were often portrayed as constantly wandering without strong attachments to any particular place. Doggerland suggests something far more complex. This was not simply a route between Britain and mainland Europe. It was a homeland. It contained reliable sources of food, predictable migration routes for animals, freshwater rivers, sheltered forests, and landscapes that families would have known intimately. Certain places almost certainly held cultural and spiritual significance. Particular lakes may have been associated with ceremonies. Ancient trees may have served as landmarks remembered across generations. Burial sites may have connected families to ancestors stretching back hundreds of years. Although much of this remains hidden beneath the sea, anthropologists believe communities living there almost certainly developed deep emotional connections to the landscape, just as people do today. This makes the coming disaster even more powerful to imagine. Unlike earthquakes or volcanic eruptions that strike without warning, the destruction of Doggerland unfolded over many centuries. The glaciers covering much of the northern hemisphere continued melting as Earth's climate warmed. After the Ice Age, every year, tiny amounts of additional water entered the oceans. The difference from one season to the next was almost imperceptible. Yet over hundreds of years, coastlines slowly retreated inland. Wetlands expanded into forests, rivers changed course. Low-lying plains became tidal marshes before finally disappearing beneath salt water. Imagine being born into a village beside a river that had existed for generations. Your grandparents tell stories of forests that once stretched far beyond the horizon. Your parents remember hunting grounds that are now flooded every spring. As you grow older, familiar paths disappear beneath shallow water. Your own children inherit a smaller world than the one you knew. Then your grandchildren lose even more. None of them witness a single catastrophic moment. Instead, each generation quietly accepts that the shoreline has moved once again. What feels permanent during one lifetime slowly vanishes across several others. This gradual transformation makes Doggerland strikingly relevant today. Around the world, rising sea levels continue to threaten coastal communities. Entire lands face the possibility of becoming uninhabitable. Major cities invest billions in flood defenses while coastal erosion steadily reshapes familiar landscapes. Although the causes and timescales differ, The experience of adapting to a changing coastline is something humanity has faced before. Doggerland reminds us that environmental change is not merely a scientific statistic. It affects homes, traditions, memories, and identities. As more land disappeared beneath the sea, the people of Doggerland were forced to adapt. Some likely migrated westward into what would eventually become Britain. Others probably moved south and east into mainland Europe. Archaeologists believe these movements helped reshape the distribution of prehistoric populations across northwestern Europe. The descendants of those communities would eventually contribute to the genetic and cultural foundations of later societies. Although their homeland disappeared, the people themselves did not simply vanish. They carried their knowledge, traditions, and survival skills into new landscapes where future generations continued their story. Yet despite centuries of adaptation, there came a point when the remaining land could no longer support the communities that had once thrived there. Doggerland had shrunk dramatically. What had once been a vast plain connecting Britain to Europe had become a patchwork of low islands separated by shallow channels and expanding wetlands. Every storm brought the sea farther inland. Every high tide claimed a little more ground. Life became increasingly uncertain. If you're enjoying this journey into one of Europe's greatest forgotten landscapes, take a moment to like the video and let us know in the comments whether you had ever heard of Doggerland before today. Your support helps Unknown Discoveries continue exploring remarkable stories that deserve far more attention than they often receive. Then, around 8,200 years ago, nature delivered what may have been the final and most devastating blow. Far to the north, off the coast of present-day Norway, an enormous section of the continental shelf suddenly collapsed. Known today as the Storegga slide, it remains one of the largest underwater landslides ever identified on Earth. Scientists estimate that thousands of cubic kilometers of rock and sediment plunged into the deep ocean in a matter of hours. The sheer force of this collapse displaced an immense volume of seawater, generating a powerful tsunami that raced across the North Atlantic. Evidence of this ancient tsunami has been discovered in Scotland, Norway, Greenland, and other parts of northern Europe. Thick layers of marine sand have been found far inland, deposited in places that ordinary tides could never have reached. These geological fingerprints reveal that massive waves swept across coastlines with tremendous force. What happened when those waves reached the last surviving remnants of Doggerland remains one of archaeology's greatest unanswered questions. Scientists cannot say with certainty exactly how many people still lived there, nor can they confirm how many survived. What they do know is that the remaining land was exceptionally low-lying and vulnerable. A tsunami of this magnitude would have flooded huge areas in a very short period of time, destroying campsites, contaminating freshwater supplies, killing wildlife, and rendering already fragile landscapes even more difficult to inhabit. For those who witnessed it, the event must have seemed almost unimaginable. After generations spent slowly retreating from the advancing sea, the ocean suddenly arrived with terrifying speed. It is easy to understand why memories of such overwhelming floods might echo through oral traditions for centuries, eventually becoming the foundation for flood stories told across different cultures. While no direct connection can be proven, the possibility continues to fascinate historians and archaeologists alike. By the time the waters finally settled, the last chapter of Doggerland was drawing to a close. The Great Plain that had once linked Britain to continental Europe was almost entirely gone. In its place stretched the expanding waters of the North Sea, creating the island geography that would shape Britain's future for thousands of years. For thousands of years after Doggerland disappeared, the North Sea guarded its secret. Waves rolled above forgotten forests. Fish swam through valleys where rivers had once flowed. Ships crossed waters beneath which entire generations had lived and died, completely unaware that a prehistoric landscape rested below them. Had fishermen never pulled ancient bones from their nets, and had modern technology never mapped this seabed, Doggerland might have remained one of history's greatest undiscovered worlds. Yet every year, science reveals a little more. Marine archaeologists now work alongside geologists, paleontologists, climate scientists, and even offshore engineering companies to reconstruct this vanished landscape with astonishing precision. Sediment cores extracted from the seabed preserve microscopic pollen grains that identify the trees and plants that once covered the land. Layers of peat reveal where forests stood for thousands of years before being submerged. Ancient DNA recovered from sediments is beginning to reveal the animals that lived there, even when no bones remain. Every new discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that has been hidden beneath the sea for nearly 8 millennia. Among the most remarkable finds are the tools left behind by the people themselves. Flint blades, hand axes, arrowheads, and fishing equipment have all been recovered from the North Sea. These are not random objects scattered by chance. They are evidence of ordinary human lives. Someone shaped those tools with patient hands. Someone carried them through forests now buried beneath the waves. Someone relied on them to feed a family, build shelter, or prepare animal hides for clothing. When we hold one of these artifacts today, we are touching something that may have last been held by another human being more than 8,000 years ago. Perhaps the greatest lesson Doggerland teaches us is how fragile our understanding of history really is. For centuries, historians believed they already knew the geography of prehistoric Europe. Maps showed Britain as an island because that is how we have always experienced it. Yet beneath the sea lay an entire chapter of human history that no map recorded and no written source described. It reminds us that history is not fixed. It changes as new evidence emerges. Every archaeological discovery has the potential to rewrite what we think we know. Doggerland also forces us to reconsider Britain's earliest story. When we think about Britain's past, we often begin with Stonehenge, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, or perhaps even the first farming communities. But long before any of those people arrived, another population called this landscape home. They hunted across plains that no longer exist. They navigated rivers now hidden beneath the North Sea. Their descendants likely became some of the earliest inhabitants of what would eventually become Britain after the rising seas separated the island from mainland Europe. In that sense, Doggerland is not merely a lost landscape. It is part of Britain's origin story. There is something deeply human about imagining those final generations. Picture a child standing beside a shoreline that has crept steadily closer throughout their parents' lives. To them, this smaller world is normal. They never knew the forests their grandparents described or the hunting grounds spoken of in old family stories. Each generation quietly accepted a landscape that was a little different from the one before it. They adapted because they had no choice. They moved their camps, found new fishing grounds, explored unfamiliar forests, and continued raising families despite the uncertainty surrounding them. That resilience may be the true legacy of Doggerland. Its people did not build pyramids that still dominate the horizon. They left no written chronicles describing the changing sea. Their names are lost forever. Yet they survived one of the greatest environmental transformations in human history, adapting over countless generations to a world that refused to remain the same. Their story is not one of sudden extinction, but of extraordinary perseverance. Today, as climate scientists study rising sea levels and coastal communities around the world prepare for an uncertain future, Doggerland feels surprisingly modern. It reminds us that humanity has always lived alongside changing environments. Landscapes we assume are permanent can transform over centuries. Coastlines shift, Rivers change course. Islands appear and disappear. Civilizations rise and fall. The Earth is constantly reshaping itself, whether we notice it or not. And perhaps that is why Doggerland continues to capture our imagination. Unlike Atlantis, it is not a legend. It is not a myth passed down through ancient storytellers. Doggerland was real. Its rivers have been mapped. Its forests have been identified. Its wildlife has been reconstructed. Its people left behind tools that archaeologists can hold in their hands. The mystery is no longer whether Doggerland existed. The mystery is how much of its story still lies hidden beneath the seabed, waiting for future discoveries. Technology is advancing faster than ever before. High-resolution sonar, underwater drones, environmental DNA analysis, and artificial intelligence are helping researchers examine parts of the North Sea that were impossible to study only a few decades ago. Every expedition raises the possibility that tomorrow's discovery could completely transform our understanding of prehistoric Europe. Somewhere beneath those waters may still lie campsites, ritual locations, wooden structures, or other traces of lives that have remained untouched since the Stone Age. If that happens, it will not simply be another archaeological discovery. It will be another reminder that history still has countless pages left to reveal. If you've enjoyed exploring the lost world of Doggerland, make sure you're subscribed to Unknown Discoveries, because some of history's greatest mysteries are not hidden in distant deserts or forgotten jungles. Many are much closer than we imagine, buried beneath the landscapes we cross every day or resting beneath oceans that seem as though they have always been there. Together, we'll continue uncovering those forgotten stories, one discovery at a time. The next time you stand on the east coast of Britain and look out across the calm waters of the North Sea, remember that you are not looking at an empty horizon. Beneath those waves lie ancient forests where birds once sang at dawn, rivers where children learned to fish, trails where hunters followed red deer through dense woodland, camps where families gathered around flickering fires, sharing stories beneath the night sky. Entire generations lived full lives there, never imagining that their homeland would one day disappear beneath the sea. For nearly 8,000 years, the ocean kept their world hidden. Now, thanks to science, archaeology, and a few remarkable discoveries pulled from fishing nets, their story has finally begun to surface again. And perhaps the most extraordinary part is this: the greatest lost world in British history was never across the ocean. It was beneath it.